She's still inside you. Even if she lives oceans away, even if her body rests in the ground, even if you haven't spoken in decades, her presence remains. Not just in memory, but in the architecture of your psyche. Carl Jung warned of this force, the one most feared yet most formative, the mother complex. It is not simply about the woman herself, but about the inner image, the emotional imprint she left behind. An invisible force that shapes your choices, your voice, your relationships, and the very story you believe about yourself. This is what Jung called the shadow mother, not the nurturing face you showed the world, but the psychic residue of unmet needs, silent expectations, and ancestral pain. And here lies the painful truth: you will never fully heal until you face her, not the outer mother, but the one who still lives within you. For many, this territory is sacred and terrifying. Jung wrote, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent." When you carry your mother's pain, her shame, her silence, her sorrow, you become entangled in a life that is not your own. You begin to live as her echo, her protector, her extension, and your soul begins to dim. This is not a path of blame. It is a call to return to yourself, to reclaim the parts of you that were never nurtured, to honor the grief your inner child was never allowed to feel, to set down the weight you were never meant to carry. In this exploration, we are not pointing fingers, we are lighting candles in the darkest corners of your psyche. Because true freedom does not come from resenting the mother, it comes from consciously facing the mother within. In this video, we will journey deep into the forbidden corners of your psyche, beyond heartbreak, beyond the ego, into the alchemical process of death and rebirth that begins the moment you finally decide to let her go. You will see why your healing has been stuck, how the mother wound has shaped your identity, and how Jung's profound teachings offer a path not just to survival, but to sovereignty. The truth is simple, though not easy. You are allowed to leave the role of the child. You are allowed to stop carrying the sorrow that is not yours. You are allowed to rewrite the myth, and it begins with one terrifying act of courage: facing the mother in your mind. Let's begin. The first, the role of the mother archetype in the collective unconscious. In Jungian psychology, the image of the mother is not limited to the woman who gave us life. She occupies a primordial seat in the architecture of the collective unconscious, a timeless, transpersonal image encoded into the very soul of humanity. To Jung, the mother is first and foremost an archetype, a universal psychic pattern, inherited rather than invented, emerging again and again in dreams, myths, and personal relationships. She is not just personal, she is eternal. The mother archetype carries a dual face: the life giver and the life devourer, the nurturer and the smotherer. This is what Jung called the paradox of the Great Mother. It is an image older than civilization, representing both safety and danger, creation and destruction, comfort and engulfment. This archetype is not bound to the historical identity of your biological mother. It lives beneath it. It shows up in religious icons, nature symbols, mythology, and even in the earth herself. The mother is both the one who feeds you and the one who threatens to consume you. For those carrying unresolved wounds from their mothers, this archetype becomes entangled with personal trauma. Jung warned that when we confuse the personal mother with the archetypal mother, we enter a psychic labyrinth, reenacting childhood pain through adult relationships, yearning for nurturing yet terrified of closeness, seeking approval while fearing rejection. The archetype, when split and unintegrated, produces psychological distortion. In dreams, the mother may appear as a gentle guardian or a monstrous figure that devours. In myth, she is both Demeter and Kali, Mary and Medea. Jung described this ambivalence as the bipolar nature of the mother archetype: good and evil, creator and destroyer, holy and profane. When the psyche clings to one side while repressing the other, we fragment. To idealize the mother is to deny her shadow. To demonize her is to reject her light. Either way, we fall into projection, casting our inner wounds onto partners, mentors, bosses, spiritual teachers, any figure carrying the symbolic weight of the mother. And this is why so many people remain stuck, because true healing of the mother wound cannot occur at the surface level. Jung insisted that we must move beyond personal grievances and into symbolic vision. When we view our mother only through the narrow lens of our childhood, her neglect, her rage, her control, we remain trapped in the ego story. But when we see her as a vessel for ancient forces, when we recognize that our pain is not just personal but archetypal, we open the door to deep transformation. Jung wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents, and it is often through the mother that this unlived life is passed down, her shame, her silence, her grief." The mother complex takes root when the mother's emotional reality becomes internalized by the child, not as a memory but as a mirror. A child who is emotionally neglected may internalize the belief, "I am unworthy of love." A child who is smothered may internalize, "I am not allowed to be separate, to be free." These voices do not vanish with age. They become the inner monologue of the adult, dictating how you see your worth, your body, your voice, your capacity to love, to belong, to thrive. Unless these inner images are made conscious, the individual will unconsciously seek resolution outside, in romantic partners, in career success, in spiritual bypassing. But the root remains untouched. The wound continues to whisper, "You are still not enough." Jung taught that the mother wound is not just a personal tragedy, it is a collective inheritance. It is a psychic pattern passed through generations, encoded like emotional DNA. Mothers unknowingly transmit their own pain, their own repression, their own disconnection from the feminine principle. And the children, unless awakened, carry it forward, until one day someone, perhaps you, has the courage to face the mother image within and say, "This story ends with me." To Jung, healing was not about changing the mother. It was about transforming your relationship to the inner mother. That complex web of associations, emotions, memories, and projections living deep within the psyche. And this work is not small, it is sacred. Because until you confront this inner image, the real transformation cannot begin. The mother is also earth. She is nature. She is the unconscious itself. When we are disconnected from the mother within, we are also disconnected from nature, from our bodies, from intuition, from the mystery of the unknown. We fear the dark, we fear feeling, we over-identify with the rational, the masculine, the controlled, and in doing so, we lose the richness of the soul. The cost of remaining blind to the archetypal mother is profound. Chronic anxiety, unresolved grief, relational dysfunction, creative blocks, spiritual emptiness, a constant sense of not belonging to yourself. Jung saw this as a psychological epidemic, a generation adrift from its ancestral roots, from the feminine depths, from the great mother who births not only bodies, but souls. So here is the threshold. Can you see your mother not only as the woman who hurt you, but as the doorway into the ancient psychic forces that shaped her? Can you recognize the archetype moving through her and through you? Can you hold her flaws and your pain without collapsing into blame or idolization? This is not about absolution, it is about liberation. Because until you see the mother image clearly, not just as mother, but as mirror, you will continue to walk in circles. Healing will remain shallow, insight will not penetrate the unconscious. But when you face the archetypal mother as she is, vast, mysterious, paradoxical, you no longer seek love from her shadow, you return to the root. You begin finally to become yourself. The second, the shadow mother and the psychological imprisonment. In Jungian psychology, the shadow mother is one of the most feared and misunderstood inner forces. Unlike the nurturing aspect of the maternal archetype, she is not the mother who protects, nourishes, or guides. She is the one who consumes. She appears in dreams, myths, and the quiet despair of adulthood as the force that clings, suffocates, manipulates, and inhibits the growth of the soul. Jung observed that this devouring aspect is not an anomaly. It is an inescapable pole of the archetype itself. The Great Mother births and devours. She creates and she withholds. And when this aspect is not faced consciously, it becomes a psychic prison from which the ego cannot escape. The Shadow Mother shows up in mythology as Demeter refusing to release Persephone, as dragons guarding sacred treasure, as goddesses who swallow their offspring. Psychologically, she emerges when maternal energy overreaches its natural bounds, when love becomes control, when protection becomes possessiveness, when care disguises dependency. In these moments, the child feels not held, but consumed. And yet, because the energy is wrapped in maternal language, "I just want what's best for you," the child cannot name the betrayal. The soul collapses inward, silently absorbing the belief, "My freedom is abandonment, my autonomy is betrayal." As Jung wrote, this force rarely enters consciousness in obvious ways. Its grip is subtle, hidden beneath layers of conditioning and inherited guilt. In adult life, it may appear as crippling self-doubt, a persistent inner critic that echoes the mother's voice. It may show up as the inability to feel safe when independent, the reflexive fear of disappointing others, or the unconscious attraction to romantic partners who control, diminish, or suffocate, mirroring the emotional terrain of the mother wound. It is the guilt that arises the moment you try to set a boundary, speak your truth, or walk away from dysfunction. The Shadow Mother whispers, "You are ungrateful, you are bad, you are selfish." This is psychological infantilization, a state Jung warned against, where the ego remains small and dependent, physically adult, but emotionally tethered to the mother's expectations. You may move cities, change your name, live across oceans, and still hear her voice in your head. Before you speak, before you act, before you dare to live. This is not about physical distance. It is about energetic entanglement. The ego remains a child, orbiting the mother's gravity, terrified to step out of line. Jung once said that the psyche prefers the known hell to the unknown heaven, and the Shadow Mother is that hell, familiar, predictable, falsely comforting. People stay in toxic dynamics not because they enjoy suffering, but because suffering preserves the psychic bond. Pain becomes loyalty. Self-betrayal becomes love. And until this pattern is made conscious, individuals will continue recreating the same conditions, believing they are choosing freely, when in fact they are acting out the myth of the devouring mother. And what is the mother's most powerful tool? Guilt. Not the healthy guilt that corrects moral failure, but a primordial guilt, an inherited, irrational fear that to separate is to die. Jung described this as the psychic leash, forged not from logic, but from archetypal fear. I am bad if I walk away. I am betraying her if I become myself. This guilt is ancient. It speaks to the terror of exile, the primal fear of losing the container of life itself. And, under its weight, many remain frozen, sabotaging joy, suppressing truth, collapsing before every act of self-assertion. But paradoxically, Jung taught that the Shadow Mother is not just the jailer, she is also the gatekeeper of the soul. She is the dragon that guards the gold, the monster you must face to retrieve your own name. The pain she causes is not meaningless, it is an initiation. In myth, the hero must confront her not to destroy her, but to reclaim what she holds hostage, the right to exist, to feel, to create, to choose. Integration, not annihilation, is the task. To do this, Jung encouraged active imagination, a conscious inner dialogue with the devouring mother within. You visualize her, you speak to her, you express the rage, the sorrow, the betrayal. You let the abandoned child speak, you let her speak. You come face to face, not with evil, but with a wounded archetypal force, distorted by generations of fear, shame, and unlived longing. And when this process is done sincerely, something shifts. The mother loses her grip. The inner child begins to stand. The psyche begins to remember that it belongs to itself. This confrontation is a psychological death and rebirth, the death of the dependent child, the birth of the sovereign adult. Jung warned that this phase is often accompanied by a collapse, depression, emptiness, grief. But this crumbling is sacred. It is the dismantling of inherited illusion. The ego feels naked, but for the first time, it is real, and it is from this darkness that light can return, not borrowed light, but the soul's own fire. So let us be clear, the shadow mother is not your enemy. She is your threshold. She is the terrible teacher, the fierce face of the feminine that demands you awaken. And when you dare to confront her, not to blame her, but to reclaim yourself, you open the door to freedom. You begin to live not as a child trying to please, but as an adult who chooses. You rise not in defiance of the mother, but in honor of what she could never complete. This is not just personal healing. This is ancestral liberation, a breaking of the psychic chain, a return to the soul. And for those who walk this path, the reward is not ease, but wholeness. The rarest and most powerful gift of all. The third, the internal mother, the silent dictator within. Within the vast architecture of the unconscious, one psychic force reigns with eerie quietness and commanding power. The internal mother. She does not shout, but she governs. She does not strike, yet she shapes. Jung described this inner figure as the internalized mother imago, a psychic echo of the maternal presence embedded so deeply in the unconscious that it often evades the light of awareness for a lifetime. Even when the biological mother is long gone, through death, distance, or estrangement, the inner mother lives on. And not as memory alone, but as a living, autonomous complex, silently scripting how we think, feel, choose, and relate. She becomes the invisible monarch of the inner kingdom, whispering into the soul of the adult what the child once absorbed without question. From our very first breath, the mother, or the one who stood in her place, became the mirror through which we glimpsed our first sense of self. Through her gaze, her tone, her embrace or her withdrawal, we learned whether we were welcome in the world or merely tolerated. Jung believed these early impressions are not merely stored in the brain, they are mythologized in the soul, crystallized into what he called the mother complex. This psychic constellation becomes the mother imago, a symbolic image that carries emotional charge, meaning, and mythic weight. And here is the tragedy. The imago is rarely accurate. It is not the mother as she was, but the mother as we perceived her, through a psyche still unformed, still desperate to survive. If the internal mother was nurturing, attuned, and consistent, she becomes an inner wellspring of self-worth and security. But if she was absent, rejecting, critical, or enmeshing, she becomes a silent saboteur, a force that, though unseen, conditions every relationship, every risk, every dream. Her voice may whisper, "You are too much. You are not enough. Don't speak, don't shine. Stay small, stay safe." Jung warned that when this voice is mistaken for the self, the individual becomes enslaved to a ghost, confusing inherited programming with inner truth. This is the birthplace of the inner saboteur, not mere insecurity, but the internalized criticism of a mother who once withheld approval or used affection as currency. The inner mother might appear in the psyche as an echo of disappointment, a command to abandon the self in favor of pleasing others, or a subtle panic whenever we dare to break away from inherited roles. Her voice arises during moments of expansion, like a hand pulling us back into the familiar prison of self-doubt. And when this internal figure is not made conscious, Jung explained, she is projected outward, onto lovers, teachers, bosses, friends. Suddenly we are no longer seeing people for who they are, but through the emotionally charged lens of our unmet maternal longing. We expect them to heal wounds they did not cause. We react to them with disproportionate fear, neediness, or rage. We chase the fantasy of being chosen, nurtured, or validated, while unconsciously attracting partners who replicate the very emotional dynamics we are trying to escape. The negative mother unintegrated becomes a filter on reality, and the result is confusion, disillusionment, and emotional repetition. In its most destructive form, the internal mother becomes a psychic vampire, not metaphorically, but energetically. She drains our vitality, she suppresses our instincts, she clouds our creative fire. This manifests as chronic exhaustion, emotional flatness, a fear of choosing boldly, or an inability to make decisions without guilt. The individual feels frozen, alive, yet estranged from life. Jung saw this as a possession, a kind of inner colonization, where the soul is no longer sovereign, but governed by a frozen image from the past. And yet, paradoxically, we remain loyal to her, even if she wounded us, even if she was cold or cruel. The psyche clings to the image, hoping that if we just stay small enough, obedient enough, wounded enough, we might finally win her love. But Jung called this a tragic illusion. The internal mother is not evolving. She is not real. She is a fixed, psychic imprint. No matter how much we contort ourselves to earn her affection, we will only sink deeper into self-abandonment. To heal, Jung insisted, we must initiate a conscious separation. Not from our physical mother, but from the inner image that holds our soul hostage. This means naming the mother complex for what it is. It means facing the inner figure directly, through active imagination, inner dialogue, dreams, and symbolic ritual. It requires us to allow the exiled feelings to rise: rage, grief, betrayal, longing. It invites us to reclaim the voice we buried, the boundaries we feared to draw, the power we once surrendered to survive. This separation is not rebellion, it is individuation, the sacred right to exist as a self, not a shadow. And it is not enough to disarm the shadow. Jung believed we must also reclaim the light, the positive face of the mother archetype, the inner nurturer, the protector, the creative force. This does not come from fantasy or denial. It comes from building a new internal relationship, one rooted not in scarcity, but in sovereignty. Through kind self-talk, inner rituals of care, connection to mythic feminine symbols, and practices of creativity and embodiment, we slowly begin to mother ourselves. And in doing so, we reclaim the parts of our psyche once exiled in the name of survival. Jung wrote, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." In the realm of the mother complex, that darkness lives in the internal mother, the silent dictator, the inherited voice, the ancestral wound. And until we face her, not with hatred, but with clarity, we remain bound. But once we do, we step into something sacred. We begin to live, not as children seeking permission, but as adults who carry within them both the fire and the gentleness of the healed feminine. We no longer wait to be chosen. We choose. We no longer beg to be loved. We love ourselves into wholeness. And in that act, the spell of the inner mother begins to break, and a deeper self begins to rise. The fourth, separation and the necessity of the independent ego. Carl Jung taught that one of the most sacred and agonizing thresholds in psychological life is the symbolic separation from the mother complex. This is not a rejection of the mother herself, but a confrontation with the archetypal gravitational field that pulls the ego back into fusion, dependence, and unconscious loyalty. Without this separation, Jung warned, there can be no individuation, no true I, no fully awakened life. The process is less a social event than it is a profound psychic rite, a death and rebirth hidden beneath ordinary adult struggles with boundaries, identity, and purpose. To remain enmeshed with the mother imago, whether through guilt, fantasy, or unconscious fear, is to live behind a veil, acting not from self-possession, but from inherited roles. The obedient child, the silent pleaser, the internal orphan waiting to be seen. Jung likened this inner severance to a second birth. The first freed the body, the second frees the soul. It is through this painful unbinding that the adult self begins to rise, not in rebellion, but in reverence for what must evolve. Yet, many resist this rite. The separation, while essential, is met with terror. Jung identified the forces that bind us: the fear of annihilation, the child's primal terror that to separate is to die, the guilt of betrayal, a psychic belief that individuation is an act of ingratitude toward the one who gave us life, the comfort of familiarity, where even suffocation feels safer than freedom, and the cultural scaffolding that elevates familial loyalty above inner authenticity. These are not mere neuroses, Jung emphasized. They are ancient archetypal currents in the collective unconscious, forces that every human must face if they are to become whole. When separation is avoided, the consequences are profound. The child archetype hijacks the adult ego. Beneath the surface of polished lives and high-functioning roles lies an inner child, unseen and unhealed, still pleading for permission to be real. These individuals live in adult bodies, but cannot claim their inner authority. They hesitate before action, defer decisions, suppress desires, and fear failure not for what it is, but for what it might say to the lingering mother in the mind. In Jung's eyes, this was not immaturity, it was psychic captivity. True separation is the hero's journey. It is the descent into the unconscious forest, the confrontation with the dragon of the mother's shadow, the protector who becomes jailer, the giver who becomes devourer. The path is littered with grief, confusion, rage, and the aching silence of ancestral memory. But to refuse this call is to live a life dictated not by soul, but by avoidance. The one who delays this journey risks existential despair, unknowingly repeating the unresolved drama of the mother complex in every partner, every job, every unmet longing. The ego must die for the self to rise. Jung described this moment as a psychological crucifixion, the death of the compliant child, the one who once believed that love could only be earned through suppression. In its place, the sovereign adult is born, not polished, not perfect, but grounded, breathing, willing to meet life as it is. This birth, like all births, is messy, demands mourning. For the childhood never lived, the illusions now shattered, and the longing that must now be faced rather than fed. Yet after death comes emptiness, a silence so wide it terrifies. The void, Jung wrote, is sacred space. It is the vacuum left behind when the mother's voice no longer fills the psyche, and it is dangerous only when we do not fill it ourselves. If we do not claim this space with our own values, desires, and inner voice, the mother's shadow returns, stronger, subtler, and more consuming. This is why separation alone is not enough. It must be followed by creation. The building of a new inner structure, not borrowed, not inherited, but forged from self-awareness. When this happens, when the individual crosses the threshold, the sovereign ego begins to awaken. This is not the inflated ego of superiority, but the stable ego of self-trust, the kind that no longer acts to please or perform, but to express the truth of one's being. It no longer makes decisions out of fear or guilt, but from alignment. It enters relationship not to be saved, but to share. This ego does not seek certainty, it embraces mystery. It does not demand applause, it honors its own voice. And behind this process lies a spiritual truth. Jung saw the break from the mother complex as more than psychological. It is the moment we step out of the known world, the mother as collective, the mother as safety, and step into the wild, sacred territory of the self. The self is not the ego's fantasy, but the deep inner guide, the force that carries our blueprint and dares us to fulfill it. When we separate from the mother complex, we are not turning away from love, we are turning toward truth. And in doing so we begin to live not as followers of scripts, but as co-creators of meaning. Ritual helps this unfold. Jung understood that thresholds must be marked. Whether through art, dream work, journaling, or sacred symbolic gestures, we give form to the formless. We declare, the old is over. We speak to the mother in our minds and say, I honor you, but I no longer belong to you, I belong to myself. We build altars not of stone, but of courage, acts of boundary, moments of honesty, breaths taken without fear of punishment. Separation, then, is not betrayal. It is devotion to life. It is the act of becoming a vessel wide enough to hold both the grief of the past and the beauty of what is yet to be. Without it, we circle the same shadows. With it, we begin the walk toward the self. As Jung once said, man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious, and in the labyrinth of the mother complex, the first doorway opens through the brave, beautiful act of letting go. The fifth, psychological symptoms of the unhealed mother wound. A depth psychology perspective. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Nowhere is this more apparent than in the silent, corrosive effects of the unhealed mother wound. When the mother complex lies dormant and unexamined, it does not disappear. It metastasizes, weaving itself through every corner of the psyche, subtly shaping one's beliefs, behaviors, emotions, and relationships. These are not random misfortunes or personality quirks, Jung warned, but archetypal patterns, manifestations of unresolved energies that have not yet been brought into the light. Let us now explore the 9 deeply rooted psychic symptoms that reveal the presence of an unhealed mother wound. Symptoms that reach far beyond the personal and into the very soul of the collective unconscious. 1. The inner critic and chronic self-doubt. One of the first signs of an unhealed mother wound is a relentless inner voice that whispers sabotage. You're not good enough. Who do you think you are? This is no ordinary self-doubt. It is the internalized shadow of the maternal voice. A psychic echo of early life experiences where love may have been conditional, approval withheld, or vulnerability punished. Disguised as logic or morality, this voice punishes the ego and stifles the emerging self. Jung described this as a complex, an autonomous fragment of the psyche that acts like a parasite, feeding off the ego's attempts to grow. 2. The fear autonomy and the clinging to dependence. Many who carry this wound find themselves torn between the longing for freedom and the terror of it. They crave independence, yet feel paralyzed when asked to stand alone. Decisions feel dangerous, success feels like betrayal, and failure becomes a means of maintaining invisible loyalty to the suffering mother image. Jung saw this dynamic as a regression into the archetypal mother's arms. Safety, purchased at the cost of the self. 3. Guilt, shame, and the inherited burden. There exists a deep, almost sacred guilt in those who attempt to separate from the mother complex. It says, "If I thrive, I betray her. If I grow, I abandon her." This is not personal guilt, it is archetypal. It stems from the primitive belief that one's survival is tied to the mother's emotional state. Jung identified this as the child unconsciously carrying the unlived life of the parent, the mother's regrets, limitations, and pain, passed down like invisible psychic inheritance. 4. The pattern of self-abandonment and people-pleasing. Those wounded by the mother's disapproval or conditional love often become experts in self-abandonment. The ego, still trained to appease, betrays its own needs in order to remain good, lovable, or accepted. Boundaries feel like threats. Saying no induces shame. Jung interpreted this as the ego still wearing the mask of the obedient child, terrified to risk the wrath of the inner mother, and unfamiliar with the sacred authority of its own voice. 5. Attracting relationships that reenact the wound. Perhaps most painfully, individuals often find themselves magnetized to those who resemble the emotional terrain of their mother wound, emotionally distant, critical, controlling, or smothering partners. This repetition is not foolishness. It is the psyche's symbolic attempt at repair. Jung noted that the unconscious recreates unresolved trauma externally, not to punish, but to heal. But unless we become aware of the projection, we mistake repetition for fate and call suffering love. 6. The core wound of not enoughness. I am not enough becomes the soul's background hum, a silent decree inherited from a mother's neglect, absence, or unreachable standards. This belief manifests as perfectionism, overachievement, shame, and the inability to feel joy without apology. Jung recognized this as the cry of the inner child, still waiting to be seen, still waiting to be touched by the warmth that never came. 7. The suppression of creativity and the fear of expression. The mother archetype is not only a nurturer, but also a creator. When that archetype is wounded, creativity becomes dangerous. Expression feels unsafe. The individual becomes paralyzed, afraid that their gifts will be judged, their voice silenced, their light rejected. Jung taught that when the devouring mother archetype dominates the psyche, the individual unconsciously fears that to shine is to provoke abandonment or worse, retaliation. 8. Somatic symptoms and the body's cry for healing. What the mind represses, the body expresses. Jung observed that unresolved complexes often manifest as physical symptoms: fatigue, anxiety, autoimmune disorders, and eating issues that reflect the split between being nurtured and consumed. These are not random ailments. They are the body's symbolic language, asking for reconciliation between the wounded ego and the forgotten inner child. 9. Spiritual alienation and existential emptiness. At the center of the unhealed mother wound lies a void, a hollowness where connection to the feminine principle, the Great Mother, has been severed. The individual may feel spiritually orphaned, forever searching for something they cannot name. They chase approval, success, or ecstasy, but nothing satisfies. Jung saw this as the soul's hunger for reconnection with the archetypal mother, the lost source of life, wisdom, and inner belonging. Final reflection for Part 5. The symptoms of the mother wound are not signs of personal weakness. They are messages. They are cries from the soul that something essential has been lost, ignored, or buried. Jung did not teach us to blame our mothers. He taught us to retrieve our projections, to face what we have exiled, and to reclaim ourselves. Healing does not mean erasing the past. It means learning how to hold it without being held hostage by it. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. In the realm of the mother wound, this is not a metaphor, it is a map. And the path begins not with blame, but with awareness. Not with rebellion, but with reclamation. The child who was never seen must now become the adult who chooses to see themselves. That is where healing begins. That is where freedom is born. The 6th. Embracing the shadow mother, a ritual of inner transformation. Within the sacred structure of Jungian depth psychology, the confrontation with the shadow mother is not merely therapeutic, it is soul-deep initiation. Jung did not consider this encounter optional for those who seek wholeness. He considered it vital. Healing the mother wound is not achieved through intellectual insight alone, nor through polite forgiveness offered from the surface of the ego. It demands a raw, symbolic descent into the underworld of the psyche, a reckoning with the archetypal mother's shadow, an encounter as ancient as myth and as intimate as your own heartbeat. The alchemy of the shadow mother. In the symbolic language of alchemy, the nigredo, the blackening, marks the first stage of transformation. It is the death of illusion. For the child trapped in the mother complex, this is the moment when the sweet veil of the idealized mother dissolves, and what emerges is something darker, the devouring aspect of the archetypal feminine. Jung taught that this darkness is not evil, it is sacred. It contains the lost fire of the self. The shadow mother, in all her terror, holds the very ingredients for freedom, creativity, and power. She is the gatekeeper of a treasure buried in fear. The act of seeing, the first step toward integration. Individuation begins the moment you dare to see her. To see the shadow mother clearly, without idealization or denial, is the soul's first act of rebellion and reclamation. It requires the courage to recognize her manipulations, her fear of abandonment, her need to possess or control, and the way she projected her pain onto the child. As long as we preserve the fantasy of the ever-giving, ever-sacrificing good mother, we remain bound in the psyche's childhood, unable to step into the sacred authority of the adult self, facing the child's rage and grief. Buried beneath obedience lies rage, and beneath that rage, grief. Jung emphasized that these emotions are not pathologies, they are sacred energies, fragments of the soul exiled in guilt and fear. To heal, one must acknowledge the fury of betrayal, the ache of not being seen, the sorrow for a mother who could not nurture as the soul required. This grief is not regression, it is resurrection. Through expression, through ritual, art, or even silent tears, we make space for the soul's return. Active imagination, dialoguing with the shadow mother. Jung's method of active imagination is a bridge between the conscious mind and the autonomous figures of the unconscious. Through it, we enter into living dialogue with the shadow mother, not to battle her, but to hear her voice. She may reveal fear, jealousy, sorrow, or loss, and through this conversation, the ego transforms. No longer a child craving approval, but an adult capable of listening, speaking, and standing with inner sovereignty. The false split of all good or all bad dissolves. Wholeness begins. The symbolic death of the mother's tyranny. This confrontation marks a death not of the physical mother, but of the psychic prison she may still represent. Nightmares, emotional storms, and crumbling beliefs often accompany this symbolic death. But in Jung's mythopoetic lens, this death is sacred. It mirrors the myth of the hero descending into the underworld to face the dragon, the mother shadow, and rising reborn. What dies is not the mother, but the ego's illusion. What is born is the soul's freedom, the return of the rejected feminine. The shadow mother does not only wound the heart, she wounds the feminine within. Intuition, softness, joy, sensuality, receptivity. When we fear the mother, we fear these parts in ourselves. But integration brings reunion. We begin to trust the inner knowing we once silenced. We express emotion without shame. We create, feel, and love, not as a child needing permission, but as a soul remembering its right to exist. Jung saw this as essential healing, especially in cultures that repress the feminine archetype. Rituals of transformation and liberation. Transformation must be marked. The psyche needs ritual. Symbolic acts. Writing unsent letters, burning them in ceremony, creating art, declaring sovereignty in sacred space, signal to the unconscious that something has shifted. Jung believed that rituals serve as thresholds. They mark the death of the old self and the birth of the individuated one. They whisper to the shadow mother, "Your reign is over. I honor you, but I no longer belong to you." The emergence of compassion, seeing the mother as human. When the work is done, something remarkable happens. The mother, internal or external, is no longer a goddess or a monster. She becomes human, wounded, yes, flawed, yes, but human. Jung taught that true compassion emerges not from obligation, but from insight. This compassion does not excuse the harm, it frees the heart from bitterness. It allows the soul to breathe again, unchained from resentment and reconnected to the river of life. Final reflection for part 6. To face the shadow mother is to descend into the cave where your fear and freedom dwell side by side. It is not an act of violence, it is an act of devotion to your truth, to your soul, to life itself. Jung called this journey individuation, the becoming of the whole self. It begins with a rupture, passes through grief, and culminates in rebirth. There is no coming to consciousness without pain, Jung wrote. But beyond the pain is your freedom. The freedom to live, not in reaction to the past, but in service to the self. The freedom to love, not from lack, but from fullness. The freedom to die, not as someone's child, but as your own sovereign soul. The 8th. Forgiveness is not the goal, freedom is. In the sacred language of Jungian psychology, forgiveness is not the crown of healing, but a shadow that may quietly follow the deeper light of inner transformation. Carl Jung did not place forgiveness at the center of the individuation process, for he knew that no authentic healing begins with moral obligation or societal performance. Instead, he taught that the true path begins with something far more difficult, the descent inward, to face, without flinching, the full reality of the wound. especially when that wound was carved by the hands that were meant to hold us. If forgiveness ever arises, Jung insisted, it must not be manufactured. It is not a ceremony for others, nor a badge of spiritual superiority. It is the quiet, unforced consequence of soul retrieval, the moment when the individual has reclaimed their psychic authority and no longer requires external resolution to be whole. Forgiveness, if it appears, is a byproduct of integration, not a prerequisite for liberation. Jung cautioned that premature forgiveness often becomes a psychological bypass, a sedative offered in place of inner fire. We are taught, especially in spiritual and religious systems, that forgiveness equates to virtue. But when forgiveness is offered too quickly, when it emerges from guilt, religious duty, or the fear of being seen as unhealed, it becomes yet another mask worn over unacknowledged rage, sorrow, and betrayal. In this form, forgiveness serves the mother complex. It is not liberation, it is suppression. Before true healing can take root, something more raw must be honored. The voice that was silenced, the anger that was shamed, the grief that was denied, the child within who waited and was never seen. Jung believed that to feel these truths is not regression, it is revolution. The individual must grieve the mother they never had, rage against the control that suffocated their becoming, and mourn the years sacrificed in loyalty to an illusion. This is not an attack on the mother, it is the emancipation of the soul. Healing begins when the mother is no longer frozen in myth, neither angel nor monster, but seen clearly as she was and is, a fallible, wounded human being. This act of humanization collapses the projections that once inflated her power and dismantles the psychic structures that kept the self imprisoned. In this space of clarity, after the storm, after the rupture, the possibility of forgiveness may emerge. But even then, it must come, not from obligation, but from the rootedness of a sovereign heart. Still, even in its absence, freedom is possible, and this is the crucial insight. Jung insisted that forgiveness is not required for liberation. What is required is integration. The individual must gather the pieces of their soul, long exiled, voice, feeling, rage, softness, and bring them back into conscious life. They must draw boundaries, not to punish the mother, but to reclaim the inner landscape once ruled by her image. The goal is not reconciliation, it is individuation. And when the individual walks that path, the inherited scripts of guilt and identification begin to dissolve. Final reflection for Part 8. In Jungian psychology, forgiveness is not the finish line. It is a leaf that may fall once the roots of the self have grown deep. The true journey is not toward reconciliation, but toward restoration of inner authority. It is the quiet revolution of no longer editing your truth to earn love, no longer muting your instincts to preserve connection, no longer shrinking to maintain the illusion of peace. Jung wrote, "Only the man who can consciously assent to the power of the shadow within himself can overcome it." In the realm of the mother complex, this means no longer waiting for forgiveness to set you free. It means you rise, you reclaim, you choose to free yourself. Not later, not when it's safe, but now. The final passage. Rebirth beyond the mother complex. In the realm of Jungian depth psychology, the healing of the mother wound is not the culmination, it is the sacred crossing into a new life. It marks not merely the resolution of pain, but the symbolic death of the self who was shaped by survival, silence, and inherited sorrow. And in that death, a rebirth begins, one no longer tethered to ancestral roles or invisible loyalties, but grounded in the sovereignty of the authentic self. Jung taught that only through conscious confrontation, mourning, and inner integration of the mother complex can we take our first true steps into psychological wholeness. This is no ordinary healing, it is metamorphosis of the soul, the dissolution of the false self. As the grip of the mother complex loosens, the scaffolding of ego built upon pleasing, performing, and preserving the family myth begins to fracture. Jung warned that this unraveling often arrives cloaked in crisis, an identity collapse, where former values seem hollow, direction disappears, and the center no longer holds. But this sacred disorientation is the negrido of the alchemical journey, the blackening phase in which the old must dissolve to make way for the gold hidden beneath. In the void left behind, something deeper stirs. The ascent of the sovereign self. What emerges from this psychic underworld is not the child returned, but the adult born anew. No longer orbiting the mother's imagined gaze, this self is guided not by guilt or longing, but by inner alignment. This reborn individual no longer seeks rescue or validation. They parent themselves. They choose presence over performance, and they begin to walk, not with apology, but with quiet authority. Jung named this the awakening of the sovereign, the self that lives from its own center. The rewriting of the inner myth. The transformation of identity requires the unraveling of an inherited script. The old narrative, I must sacrifice myself to be worthy, I am never enough unless I earn it, must be unbound from the psyche. In its place, a new myth emerges, one written not in reaction to the mother's pain, but in reverence for one's own truth. Jung considered this inner revision a sacred rite, the individual stepping out of a family tragedy and becoming the author of a new symbolic life. The sacred boundaries of individuation. With this emergence comes the necessity of boundary, not to punish, but to protect. The external mother, if still present, must be met with clarity. The internal mother, her voice of shame, fear, or guilt, must be recognized and gently disempowered. Jung emphasized that boundaries are not severances of love, but declarations of selfhood. They are the psychic lines that guard the adult from regression and honor the hard-earned terrain of the self. The reclamation of the inner mother. A profound shift occurs when the need for external nurturance is withdrawn and rerouted inward. Here, the archetypal inner mother is reclaimed, not as the voice of judgment, but as the whisper of intuition, softness, and care. Self-parenting becomes a living ritual. Rest becomes sacred. Emotion is honored without apology. Jung understood this as the reintegration of the feminine principle, where being is no longer seen as weakness, but as wisdom in motion. The rebirth of creative life. Once freed from the mother's unconscious dominion, the soul begins to flower again. The creative force, long paralyzed by fear of rejection, begins to move. It may come as words, visions, touch, or movement. Jung believed this creative renewal was not decoration, but evidence that individuation is taking root. For to create is to claim authorship of your life, to act, not from wounding, but from wonder, returning whole to the world. Jung taught that individuation is never self-centered. It prepares the individual to return to the collective, not as a fractured child seeking healing from others, but as an adult who can offer presence, wisdom, and love. Relationships transform. They are no longer reenactments of loss, but vessels of reciprocity. Purpose becomes a channel, not for approval, but for contribution. This is the matured self, standing in the world without shame, breaking the spell for future generations. Perhaps most miraculously, Jung saw the healing of the mother wound as a transgenerational act. To confront and integrate it is to interrupt the ancestral pattern. No longer is the mother's pain unconsciously passed on. Instead, the healed individual becomes a conscious ancestor, one who returns not to rescue the mother, but to redeem the line. This is the deeper offering, to be the one who ends the spell and births a new legacy of wholeness, creativity, and freedom. Final reflection. Rebirth, in Jungian psychology, is not about becoming who you were before the pain. It is about awakening to the truth of who you were always meant to be. It is the quiet rebellion against inherited guilt, unconscious loyalties, and familial shadow. It is the radical act of taking the pen back into your own hands. As Jung so powerfully wrote, your vision will become clear only when you look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. who looks inside, awakes. And in the aftermath of the mother wound, awakening means this: no one else is coming to rewrite your story, because now you are the author, and the page before you is blank. If something within this message stirred you, if even a single word mirrored your inner experience, I invite you to let your voice be heard in the comments. Have you encountered that soul whose presence feels like home, or are you still walking the sacred path back to yourself? Your story, however unfinished, may become the lantern in someone else's darkness, the very sign they didn't know they were searching for. And if someone close to you is silently struggling with the illusion that love must hurt, that self-abandonment is the price of connection, or that they are unworthy of peace, share this video with them. Help me reach the ones who need to remember: real love does not demand that we shrink. True connection does not ask for sacrifice of the soul. And the most vital union we will ever form is the one with our own inner truth. Before you go, I invite you to subscribe and activate the notification bell. Here, in this space, we journey beneath the surface of things, exploring the hidden architecture of the psyche, the whispers of the unconscious, and how every relationship is but a mirror reflecting our personal evolution. If there's a theme, a question, or a wound you would like us to explore in future videos, leave it below. This space breathes because of you. Your voice is not only welcome here, it is essential. Thank you for showing up, not just to this video, but to your inner work, to the sacred labor of remembering who you truly are. And always remember this: when the right person appears, your soul will know, not through fear, but through peace. But until that moment, let your most intimate relationship be the one you cultivate within. That is the foundation, that is the home. And from that wholeness, all things real are born. Until next time, I'll see you on the path.